Welcome to Rewear at the Fashion Pulpit, a podcast aimed at reintroducing new language around the way we speak about clothes. I'm your host, Seng Rin, and I use she, her pronouns. In each episode, we explore what it means to be a part of the fashion system and how we can be more intentional in the ways we forge a personal relationship with our clothing. So I'm currently wearing a grey top. It's sleeveless. It's really comfortable and airy. I'm thinking it's of a cotton material, and also I've layered it with two of my favorite necklaces at the moment. And I'm currently situated in our studio. It's If you hear a little bit of buzzing in the background, that's from the air conditioning downstairs. But I'm surrounded by clothing, which is apparently a really good noise um, absorbent. Is that a right word for it? So I'm hoping that the fabric is engulfing me and creating good um, audio for for you folks listening in. And if you're watching on video, welcome. And yeah, let's jump right into it. In today's episode, we're discussing the elephant in the room. Shortly after the COVID-19 pandemic broke out globally, the reinvention of the fashion system was widely discussed and reported in boardrooms, on mainstream media platforms, and by activists on Instagram. Just as we were hopeful that this was finally the turning point for fashion, almost like a wake up call, it's delayed, but due to happen nonetheless. Ultra fast fashion companies like Boohoo actually reported an increase in revenue as high as 41% during the lockdown. This was the same period as the release of the now apologized for £5 masks that came with messages such as eat, sleep, isolate, repeat, or if you can read this, you're too close. Evidently, fast and ultra fast fashion companies dissociate themselves from compelling reasons to ensure that the fashion industry remains to be what it claims to be or what it wants to be, which is human focused and creatively problem solving. Very recently, Shein, a real time fashion company, came into the spotlight for its unimaginable speed of production and notoriously viral TikTok hauls. In fact, they're coined to be real time because they are able to cut short the design and production process to as short as 3 days. According to an article by Vox, Shein raked in close to $10 billion in 2020, which was reportedly its eighth consecutive year of revenue growth over 100%. The retailer is also one of the most talked about brands on TikTok and YouTube, and the most visited fashion and apparel sites in the world. I will be linking this article in the show notes and also in the description box. So please check it out and read it if you're interested.
Alright, editing me here, and I wanted to re record this portion because I feel like I hadn't put my point across as coherently as I would have liked the first time. So here's take two. I went on to do some research and digging on the history and evolution of Shein and thought it would be interesting to share what I found. So they first launched in 2018 as a site that sold wedding dresses and women's apparels and were known as SHEINSIDE. In 2014, it acquired its own supply chain system and actually successfully transformed itself into a fully integrated clothing retailer. In the same year, they purchased another Chinese e-commerce retailer known as Romwe, which I am actually quite familiar with because they were really popular on YouTube during those days. There were so many Romwe YouTube hauls. I'm pretty sure you can still search for them on YouTube right now. And then in 2015, they shortened their name to Shein to be more memorable and therefore marketable and searchable on the internet. And as we now know, Shein's financially successful business model isn't driven by having that much of a physical presence. Instead, it's a solely e-commerce operation, selling directly to consumers by building a huge online presence. I juxtaposed the evolution and brand positioning of Shein with that of Forever 21. Like Shein, Forever 21 were really popular among students and younger consumers because of their huge selection of trend-led and cheap fashion items. The difference between the two is that while Shein focuses on expanding their online presence and using data as a vehicle to drive direct sales, Forever 21 invested heavily in opening physical stores all around the world and pretty much relied on their physical brand presence to remain relevant and competitive. which has unfortunately proven to be an antiquated form of business expansion as they declared bankruptcy in 2019. But what's non-negotiable is that they are both fast fashion brands, both Shein and Forever 21, and have extremely opaque supply chains and ambiguous and baseless sustainability commitments. It is crucial to know that the backend of Shein is the reason why they've managed to grow to the giant that they are now. On top of using Google's Trend Finder, they scour the internet and refer to their own in-app and consumer-informed website data. So this allows them real-time data to accurately predict the popularity of certain products and trends. According to an article by Green is the New Black, Shein automatically forecasts demand and adjusts inventory in real time. So unlike other fast fashion brands that might not be as data rich and informed, Shein can first start by producing a batch of clothing in small quantities. So according to an article by Vox, when a product is live, Shein creates more first-party data, which it then uses to automatically adjust production on the fly. This means that they are consistently at the top of the game when it comes to creating micro-trends and offering competitive prices, and ensuring that people buy what they produce. So if a specific top goes viral overnight on TikTok, for example, Shein will be able to instantaneously ramp up production on the garment and place additional orders depending on real-time demand. So this all sounds like, perhaps a solution as to only producing what people want and demand for. But what happens is that micro trends are created, and these are actually projecting false demands. So we might actually not need any of what Shein is producing, but because of the way they market themselves, because of the way they reach out to influencers on TikTok and Instagram, and the way they infiltrate their content into our everyday lives, this is a problem. And this is why real-time fashion, just like fast fashion, in fact, is a even larger problem. This speedy turnover informed by data means that they actually produce tens of thousands of new units every day, just like every other fast fashion brand. So my question really is, why has the fashion industry, an industry that in recent years shouted so loudly about its commitment to sustainability, allowed for companies like Shein to thrive? Yes, we should be refining and redesigning our production lines to produce more accurate quantities, and they should be more data and tech driven. But what does this say about the unimaginable scale and quantities that we still produce at? Or the production timeline of fashion that has just become shorter than ever before? I think the question that we should be asking all the time is also, what does this say about fashion and the system, coughs, capitalism, that only thrives under the circumstance of driving trends and this relentless pursuit for novelty? What does this really mean for fashion? We've come to gradually understand that all variations of the fast fashion business model is harmful and damaging. So Shein's virality really boggled my mind. And so I want to find out how and why Shein has managed to propel their popularity exponentially, particularly so in a time like now. I wanted a deeper understanding of what goes on behind the scenes of a fast fashion brand. So I invited Najah Onn, founder of Fashion Fidelity, to have a conversation with me on the complexities of the industry's supply chain.
Najah, it's really my pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Can you please tell me a bit more about yourself and what you do?
Hi, Sin. Thank you so much for having us on your podcast. My name is Najah Onn. I am actually an environmental engineer by training. I actually study environmental engineering, and I've been doing that for the last 17 years. I've always been into fashion and style, and so recently I decided to pivot a little bit. I set up my own sustainability consultancy. I've seen a lot of, problems in the fashion supply chain. I thought, why don't I do something about it? I think as an environmental engineer, I have something to offer, behind the scenes sort of thing. I understand manufacturing, I understand best practice, I understand cleaner production, and also, I guess, supply chain challenges. And also, the thing about working in sustainability for a long time is that you kind of understand what people expect of you, what people see, and from the inside, what kind of language do you use to actually make sure that you're fully transparent but also honest to your customers? fashion doesn't necessarily sort of employ people outside of fashion. And so in the last couple of years, I was actually based in Malaysia. I'm actually now in Melbourne, Australia, just because, you know, the world's been turned upside down a little bit. But part of that work is that I help sort of startups and also established brands kind of maybe have a look at how their business is run. And I use sustainability principles at work to improve their business practices overall. So that's what I do now.
Okay, that's really interesting. And also, I'm like a huge fan of your Instagram account. Like everything is like your messages are really concise and they're very well put together. Do you want to speak a bit about that and you know how you put everything together?
Yeah, sure. So fashion fidelity is like my little alter ego. You know, I'm like an environmental engineer by day, and then the rest of the time I kind of talk about fashion on this platform. Fashion fidelity, when I started in 2008, I guess that account, I was already blogging then. I have my own blog. I realized a lot of the information on, I guess, sustainability in fashion really just scrapes the surface of what really happens behind the scenes. So I guess I wanted our mantra to be, I am talking to the more informed consumer. And obviously on this journey, I've had a lot of people on different journeys as well on their own sustainability journey. Obviously I operate a B2B business, but then the fashion fidelity platform is a more consumer oriented sort of platform. I've had to, I guess, rejig some of the information that I put out on there, but it's a good balance between what I would say having thought-provoking and really conscientious sort of conversations and balanced conversation about fashion. When I first started, that wasn't happening. I think there's more of those accounts now. So I think there's a lot more people offering in that space. But I would say like that was my idea. And one of the things that I came out with in my blog was, you know, hashtag conscientious fashionista. And what I like to draw upon is the word conscientious. Conscientious actually means being thorough. And so, you know, when I look at some of the sort of activism that was happening many years ago now, everyone would, you know, ask simple questions like, which textile's better than the other, or which brands should I buy against the other? And I think that sort of conversation was a little bit too shallow. And I think we just need to add a bit more input into that. So Fashion Fidelity really is a platform to kind of expose the whole of the fashion supply chain. I like to break it down as sort of 4 categories. So you have textiles production, you have textiles manufacturing. You know, production means like growing the cotton or, you know, shearing the wool off the lamb or growing silk, you know. And then you have to yarn it, you have the dyeing process, and then you have the manufacturing, which normally people would skip that bit and then they talk about people in factories, right? Which we call in the industry cut, make, and trim. Or ready-made garment manufacturing, RM. And so that's the bit that people always see back in the day anyway. I think there's more conversations around that now in terms of the supply chain. But the third part of the fashion supply chain, I like to say the consumer part, as in the use part. I think people forget that we are actually part of the supply chain as well. And then after that, we have the post-consumer part, which is like, okay, I'm done with my clothes. What do I do with it now? And so Fashion Fidelity is really a platform to bring together all of those supply chain conversations into the spotlight for everyone to kind of deconstruct and dissect and have a really sort of balanced conversation around all of the issues.
Ask you about, you know, the manufacture part of like the fashion supply chain, because like you said, it's cut, make, trim, it's dyeing, it's processing, and it's also working with raw materials. That is also included in the production side of things, right? So can you
Correct.
just walk us through maybe a more sort of like detailed explanation for listeners or for viewers who might not
I
actually
wanted
know
to.
what really goes on behind the scenes? Can you please break it down to us in like simple, understandable language? Yeah.
I'll try. It's a big one to cover.
Yes, it's a big one. It's a big one. It's a big one. Yeah.
It's funny, like my first blog post was, "We are dumb consumers because we don't know how our clothes are made." That was my first blog post ever. And I'm not saying everyone's dumb, but to have a bit of an awareness about what happens in your everyday life and the things that you consume is really the first step in sort of being conscientious, I think. I understand I come from a business background in terms of, businesses have a role to play in terms of their own way of doing things, but we can get to that in a minute. But going back to, I think, fashion in the start of it, I think a lot of people, nowadays, you open up a fridge at the supermarket and you get milk, and some people don't even know where milk comes from. Or you open the tap in your house and you can drink water from the tap, and people don't really understand the process that goes, before it comes there, you can consume it. So I think the same goes into fashion. And can I make a distinction? Fashion doesn't necessarily mean fashion. When people like me, or when you interview people on podcasts, or you look at them on TV, when they say fashion, and the statistics that you get in some of the social media, the news outlets and stuff, when they say fashion, they mean TCF, which is textiles, clothing, and footwear. So fashion really is a language that we use now, is a catch-all to kind of fit in all the things that we manufacture that people wear. So that distinction is very important. I always try to make that distinction when I do presentations. And it's easy for a lot of people to think fashion's nothing really to do with us or with me. I'm not fashionable. I'm not high fashion, or I don't buy branded things. So I'd like to maybe just start the conversation by making that sort of distinction. When we talk about fashion, we're really talking about clothes, accessories, footwear.
Yeah.
So that also includes things like textiles, which is, your bed throws and your, Manchester linen, that type of stuff. So going back to the start of making clothes, I think it is important for people to understand what you wear now. You have to finish it. You wouldn't be walking around with something nice on your body without it already being through a round of chemicals, a round of treatment, a round of dyeing, a round of bleaching, and all these sorts of things. And textiles doesn't just happen. They actually come from what you call yarn, or like maybe in your consumer language, you call it thread, right? So like yarn is then something that is spun from a sort of material, and that material can come from a plant, or an animal, or a fiber sort of thing. So I think it's important for people to realize that when we talk about making clothes, there's a whole different industry out there that actually just makes textiles to start with.
Right.
And then
Yes.
after you get sort of like rolls and rolls of textiles in different colors, different sort of embroidery, different sort of beading and artwork attached to it, and also different sort of sort of knots and sizes. That's when you kind of then cut, make, and trim it into the
right
design that you want. Fashion, takes about it's a bit funny, the numbers in fashion at the moment. Some people are saying it's about 10% in terms of the whole industry of global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. However, it's also interesting that we can't just use that language to describe fashion, because fashion is an industry that consumes consumables. So we consume chemicals, we consume water, we consume energy. And so if you want to kind of talk about its impact on the planet, we have to be wary of, like not just to think about it based on greenhouse gas emissions, but also water consumption, chemical consumption, but also labor practices. So that's
Yeah.
probably the four main elements of in terms of its resources. There's also what you call things like, you know, making the finished products requires raw materials. And so we grow cotton, and cotton is a very thirsty yarn. It's not necessarily the most environmentally friendly yarn. You can find that information on the internet, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But we also make, you know, more than 65% of our, you know, clothing now is made out of things that are made out of oil. So like plastics is the origin, which is synthetic. And, you know, that's because technological advances have made us emulate a lot of the natural properties of textiles. For example, we can emulate antibacterial properties from wool, or we can emulate the silkiness of silk in, you know, rayon, for example. And so this is what we call fashion technology or textile technology, and this is all happening all behind the scenes anyway. As normal consumers, we don't necessarily see it. We just know, oh, this feels nice. So we don't necessarily, you know, give that thought, and it's not no one's fault. It's just that I think people forget that something that you wear today that looks luxurious and it feels nice on your body has probably touched more than 100 hands before you. And, you know, I think up to about 100 steps. And that's the fashion supply chain. Yeah, from growing the crop, for example, or, you know, having a byproduct of leather from an animal or something, down to you, the box, you know, coming into your bedroom or your living room and you buy it from the shop. I think there's something about 100 steps that's involved.
Yeah. That's, thank you so much for pointing it out and for just like, you know, explaining and breaking it all down. And I think I just wanted to go back to, like, you know, the part where you mentioned that they are sort of like a finished product has all these tiny steps prior to the to finishing an actual clothing product, like a piece of an item of clothing. And there's a lot of talk around, like, say, transparency and accountability when it comes to making sure that, you know, all the tiers in the supply chain are accounted for. Can you just tell us a bit more about, like, why is it that subcontracting happens, and what is subcontracting in layman terms, and how that looks like in this whole disconnected maze that consumers are unable to figure out and are just, like, you know, entirely cut out of because these are information that are not included in marketing language, because it obviously doesn't benefit fashion companies and corporations. So can you kind of, like,
sure,
you know, yes.
I might have to do a presentation or something, because this is something that I cover with my clients. But that is really good questioning. We go back into tiers and supplier transparency. What happens in fashion is that a lot of people have decided now, businesses, to maybe, let's say, publish their suppliers, what I would call them as tier 1 and 2 suppliers. But what people don't see is that when it comes to the garment factories, or you might call sweatshops or whatever it is, right? That's only a little bit of the picture. What happens before it came there? It must have gone through a much more dirtier process, such as textiles manufacturing and production. Usually they involve heavy chemicals. I don't know if you've been to any of, you know, factories, yarn factories, but they're full of dust. You know, the way that we actually harvest cotton hasn't really changed in 100 or so years or more. When you think about cotton, you know, we grow them, we still use pesticides or herbicide, we use water. They might have a better yield now in terms of technology and genetically modified crops, but, if we weren't using sort of back-breaking labor like we did, it's obviously there's colonization in terms of the trade slaves, African slaves.
Yeah.
So even if we're not using people anymore, and by the way, we still are in some places in the world,
Yeah.
it might be mechanized now. That actual step 1, 2, 3 until about 10 or something hasn't changed very much.
Right.
It's a very ancient crop, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And farming is also ancient. Anything that you farm, you have to, plow the land and things like this, sow it with seed, things like that. The other thing that's important to remember is that then you have textiles production. So in textiles production, you have to get rid of what we call, it's the same as you make tissue paper and things like that. You are working with a natural product, but you want the outcome to be a consistent quality. So then it's a bit like putting, fibers into a washing machine, adding a little soap, a little disinfectant or whatever, it comes out as a paper mache, and then next minute machines make them into thread or yarn. So there's a lot of chemicals involved, and that's not necessarily the issue. The issue is some countries who operate these sort of factories are not, I suppose, very much in compliance with best practice of how we manage our wastewater, for example, or discharges from your, emissions of, factory emissions and things like that. So, for example, something that might not be allowed in Australia, we go into India or we go into Bangladesh or we go into certain other places in the global south, they're allowable, So the thing with production is that we have technology. It's not like you have to reinvent the wheel. You can clean your wastewater products, you can purify the air, you can collect dust, you can have sort of safety mechanisms to keep people, healthy and safe in their workplaces. That is not the issue, that the technology is there. It's just a lack of compliance in some of these places. So we don't have to look very far for that. There's also standards for hiring people and keeping people safe, and labor laws across the world that actually makes it quite clear what kind of conditions are acceptable. All of these are available. So when I talk about textiles production and sort of the fashion supply chain, I cannot talk about it without telling you about globalization. There are many sort of, I guess, thoughts out there about when it started, but I'll probably focus on maybe after peak oil and after industrialization in the 1950s, where we have coal power plants and we have mechanized sort of, cars and things like that. Towards the late 70s, early 80s, we had what we call the internet. So the internet changed everything. And I don't know if you recall, but in the 1990s, when globalization started, a lot of these big sort of companies, it started off with electronic companies like, your IBMs and things like that. They started to venture out into different places in the world because legislation actually was relaxed in terms of having your factories based somewhere else to
like offshoring, right?
Correct, things like that. So that is probably the start of where fashion changed its game to what we see now. So you might have seen, old stories about Nike and sort of like, sweatshops. That's when the term sweatshops came about in Indonesia and places like where they make their shoes and stuff. They've gone a long way since then. But I think what people have to realize is that all of these things didn't just happen overnight. Other things made fast fashion possible, with the relaxation of tariffs, of cotton, for example. America didn't used to want to have cotton imported from overseas because they wanted to protect their own cotton industry, and so they would only supply from their own shores. So if you think about that experience and then just multiply that with different regions around the world, different regions with what we call free trade agreements, coupled with the internet, fashion's supply chain is now a global factory supply chain. And that is why it is so hard for us to understand where anything has come from. It's not just fashion, it's food, it's your computers, it's your phones and stuff like that. To actually summarize it, I would say that understanding where your supplies are is actually a good starting point. I can talk about sustainability reporting later on if you want. There are sort of issues with that as well. But I think we are confusing reporting with actually having an impact onto our processes on the planet and to people and animals. So I would always tell businesses, don't get confused with the more you report, the better you are, because that's not the end game. The reporting is supposed to be just a tool to actually understand what your footprint is about and then do something about it and actually extend your responsibility to areas that you can extend it to. But that's a whole other conversation. Basically, I think what's important to understand is that if people haven't really looked at a point of reference in time for fashion, I think they should, which is obviously the 2013 Rana Plaza collapse. And so the Rana Plaza collapse kind of was an expose into how opaque the fashion supply chain is. And obviously, since then, that's the birth of fashion revolution in terms of, who made my clothes campaign, that sort of thing. And as you said, transparency is the first step. People have to understand that subcontracting happens everywhere. It happens in construction, it happens in food, all sorts of different things. But just be wary that even though companies have responsibility, I think individual action is so, so, so powerful. I talk about it in my latest blog post. I say, is there a perfect wardrobe? And the way that I ask people to really consider their choices is to consume differently. And it's really about understanding how do you consume differently in your everyday life. I'm not here to tell you don't wear clothes. We need clothes, to provide ourselves warmth and to actually maybe explore our identity or, kind of belong to a cultural group, whatever it is, right? I think there is a balance there between making something a product that is has what I call an inherent purpose versus making a product that is just there to fill out your pockets with greedy money. And I think so. I'm not against businesses. Businesses can still make money. I just don't think you need to make completely overly ridiculous amounts of it.
That's right.
So for example, if H&M wants to start with a collection and things like that, they actually already know what they want their product to look like, what the design is going to be like, in what color, right? So they say, look, I have this particular product, I want it in 5 colors and all these sorts of sizes and what we call SKU. And they say, who can make it for me at this price? They've already priced it. They said, who can make it for me $1? And then so these factories, and for example, if I go to Bangladesh as an example, the ready-made garments industry, you have what you call middlemen, and there's sort of they have a bunch of what you call work planners or work schedulers or factory planners, and they are on the phone to these buyers from H&M, and so they're like, I know someone who can make 50,000 pieces of this at $1, and then they're like, they have access to then the factory owners in Bangladesh. Now they have access to these factory owners, but the factory owners are like, no, I can make 50,000 at 80 cents a piece. And then another factory owner says, I can make it 50 cents a piece, because they want that contract. So this middleman person is on the phone to H&M and says, yep, I can take all 2 million orders or whatever it is, right? And that person has a lot of power. And when he says this factory owner here can make it for 80 cents, he doesn't know that that factory owner might make it for 80 cents in this period of time, and that factory owner might subcontract it somewhere else. So in my language, that's what we talk about subcontracting. That's what we talk about in terms of driving prices down, and also getting the contract. And these are these factory owners' livelihoods. But you can imagine when it is a price war, and when you want to make when you want to produce, cut, make, and trim a lot of clothes for a big client, how much undercutting is involved, and that normally reflects in the conditions of the workers.
Yeah. Thank you so much for clarifying that. I think that's I've learned so much from just, this short conversation that we've had. I think now that we've sort of like kind of broke down all the little parts of the fashion supply chain, I think I want to go back to speaking about Shein and how real-time fashion has unfortunately become a thing of a current reality. From my research and what I've been reading about how Shein manages their supply chain, they use a lot of like user-generated data from their apps and from their application, their mobile application, and also from their website. And also they use like Google Trend Finder to sort of like predict or forecast demand or create a false illusion of a demand, and then go on to sort of produce in smaller batches and in smaller quantities, and then sort of like test out the market, like test the water and see whether that would become like the next viral fashion item. So and then they do all of this in 3 days. So my question really is, how is this possible when, like you mentioned earlier, a piece of clothing actually goes through the hands of like over hundreds of people? How I can't imagine, like, it's unimaginable how everything can be compressed into as short as 3 days. Like, what does that actually mean for us in real life? Like, just away from the numbers and away from data, like, what does that actually look like?
Okay, I'm going to get to the answer in a bit, but I have to give you a bit of background. It's important to understand how we've got here. So when I said before, the traditional method of, making clothes, you have trend fairs and all that. I feel like you can probably maybe classify that with some of the more departmental store brands, what we call evergreen brands that are not sort of Zara or sort of H&M, or Uniqlo, any of that stuff, right? And so it was a slower process, from actually going to a sort of fair, where they introduced the new color or the new material or how they finish a product or whatever it is. That probably is 2 years, right? Before that stage to your house, owning that product. Okay, so it was lower. And obviously there are trend forecasters and things like that. And what they do, they bring some of these ideas from, global sort of places. And then they're like, okay, I'm in Australia now. I think Europe is into this. Maybe I can create something from what I've learned over there, and then create something for my season and my collection. Fashion used to have 2 seasons in a year: spring, summer, autumn, winter. It's not like that anymore. And I think fashion now already knows that system is antiquated, because from that stage, when I say 100 steps, you have things like sampling, and you have things like, where you create waste on the shop floor, and you have to kind of test out some of your things with maybe a slower method. And again, I think technology has accelerated these sort of steps. So you might condense it. You might take away 20 steps, for example, from, for example, some of the more technical stuff is important to acknowledge. So I want to have silk pants with this design. You might see that. You might see a couple of trends and you might want to mix the two. But then you go to your supplier who makes samples for you, and they might be offshore, right? They're like, I can't print this color on this material. So some of the more technical textile stuff happen. You have a bit of a to and fro. You have to test this, and is it going to work? Is this print going to work? Is this color? Is this embroidery going to work? Is this bead going to work? Whatever it is, right? So that process used to take a lot of to and fro, and then the stretch and stuff like that. So, and then there are people in the supply chain whose job is to actually make these things happen, and they're like, hey, H&M, I've got this material, it's new now, it's stretchable, you could probably make jumpers out of this or whatever. And so there was a lot of things happening. So fast forward to the 21st century, in the last decade or two, obviously Zara has gone a little bit, they're an innovative company. They've decided, I'm going to cut short the time of having I want to go against what fashion, made themselves famous for. All of this 100 steps before me is too time wasteful. And I understand where they're coming from, because they're like, I want to offer customers something that they like in a shorter amount of time, in different colors, different sizes. And so what they've done is they've revolutionized the design process. So for example, instead of over ordering like so many things in blue, they said, I want it in white. And they've maybe decided to use the process upside down, or back to front. So they're like, I want you to save this many yardage of this fabric, but have it white. And then when I have the user generated content, in terms of, they started that trend first, right? They started all that first. They used technology to figure out what it is that the customers want, what customers buy in their stores and things like that. They put it all together. And they're like, I think the next season color should be this. Then they go back to the supplier and then they dye it a different color, because then they stop that wastage. Instead of buying everything in this color and then doesn't sell, because when I said to you, the trend, the going to the fairs was 2 years ago, that changes. Like someone decides that that's going to be the next big thing, and then 2 years later you order that and then no one buys them. And this is why fashion has such a big overproduction and big wastage problem. So fast forward to now, I don't know how you say it. Is it Shein or is it Sheen? I'm not sure. Shein has only been in my radar recently. I do not know where they've come from. I seriously, I don't even know. So ultra fast fashion, when you say they use user generated content and things like that, they're actually using the very technology that people like myself and people who are innovators in this space have been telling the fashion industry to do, actually. When we say things like data-driven demand, reconciling your supply chain at the front and also the back, and actually making things based on what people would like or would sell, they're actually utilizing all of that. So they've used AI, they've used virtual reality, they probably have smaller batches, as you said before, and that is not actually implausible. And what I say to people nowadays is that fast fashion doesn't necessarily need to be bad. What is bad, I actually now like to use the term disposable fashion. So you can actually make good clothes fast nowadays. You can make good clothes fast. We don't need to go back to the time where we have 2 fashion seasons in a year and people have to go to the fashion fair, right? Who creates these trends anyway? So that was the history of how it all started. And so it's evolved into now becoming like having things that are nice and cool to wear, available to people and accessible to people at super speed, and record time, which is what we've been telling fashion companies to do. What Shein has done, though, is obviously we don't know how exactly they do it, and that's why we're a little bit worried, right? So when you say, how can you condense all these steps and make things quick, it's something that I've told the supply chain and fashion companies to do. like use user-generated data. Obviously, don't infringe on anyone's design, please, which they've been,
Which
caught
Shein
doing.
has, multiple
That's right.
times. Yeah.
That's right.
Mm.
But all of this technology is in our hands now, right? And we have a lot of things that can enable us to reduce waste, to only produce on demand or produce limited quantities, or have on time, when you say real time, supply, right? So these are not necessarily bad things, in my opinion. It's just that with Shein, their supply chain is very opaque. So
Yeah,
if they
extremely
wanted,
okay.
that's right. If they wanted to celebrate the fact that there are pioneers and innovators in this space, then they should just shout from the top of the hills about it and say, we're very proud of our innovation, and we've used proprietary technology or whatever it is. But then also tell a story about how everything got there. So
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I think I think then it goes back into like the intention of doing it, right? Like the intention is
Yeah.
obviously not to be like, hey, we found this new sort of like way you can use the technology, and also you can use AI to sort of like predict demand, or sort of allow yourself access to all these user generated data, and then produce accordingly and make accordingly. They're not about being like, oh, like this is open source, like information. They are just, I think, in my opinion, like a data driven tech company using clothing as product making, and then profiting through it. I don't think Shein is a fashion company. I think they are a tech company. So maybe that is what's wrong. That is what's up.
I absolutely agree. So one of the things I tell my clients who want to start, or even if I have mentors wanting to enter this space, it doesn't matter what produce you make, or products, sorry. It's very important to understand why you exist. What is your why? What is your purpose? And don't confuse it with your how. So Shein's how, or Shein's how, could be that it is clothes, but their why is probably collecting data, right? And they're selling all that data, and they're making a lot of tons and tons and tons of money out of that information to all of their stakeholders. I don't know who they are, right? So I agree with you 100%. Don't get confused that they're a fashion company. They're actually a very savvy company that uses technology, Internet of Everything, to actually propel their product forward. Now, if you think about things that way, then you realize, am I a sheep? So then if you're buying from Shein, then you realize, oh crap, I think I might have gotten, I'm going in for a joyride here. And I think I've been taken advantage of. And I think that's the language that we need to be having about these things.
I still think it is almost like a insight to the fact that the fashion industry is still, or at least the mainstream fashion industry, like big fashion, is still solely profit seeking. It's, there's no other way to put it, I think. And in your opinion, like, how does that, I guess my question is, how does that make you feel? And like, what does that mean for all of us as clothing wearers and as users, like you mentioned earlier, right? Like, what does that mean? It's also, I think, going back to you mentioning that we have to be conscientious when it comes to consuming fashion and participating in the system in fashion. And I think I also wanted to add on my take, which is that maybe what we need is also compassion. Maybe conscientiousness comes before compassion. Like, you sort of have the understanding, and you don't need to have full complete comprehension of everything, but like you need to kick in, like have the empathy kick in and be like, yeah, like my wardrobe is human, and there is all these human aspects that are attached to what I wear. So yeah, like how do you feel about all of this?
No, that's very thought-provoking. Thank you for that question. I agree with you. Compassion is important. And if you hark back to the days of your grandma, right? For example, my grandma's, bless her soul, that she's still around in Malaysia. She's going to be 88 next year.
Wow.
Yes, so I tell tidbits of her little stories in my presentations to clients. So I often tell people, anything that you consume has to have a value that is significant to you. That is how you find meaning in how you consume, whether it be clothes or shoes or your furniture, right? So fashion, the reason why fashion is very much profit-based at the moment, as you rightly called it so, is because it's not been regulated as an industry. So one of the things that I see should happen in the future, pretty much medium-term future, is regulation. So we talk about sustainable fashion or sustainability in fashion or all these things. I have to go back to the fact that I'm an environmental engineer and I've worked in different industries, and fashion has been slow in its uptake of sustainability principles because singularly of regulation, lack of regulation. So you might have to set standards. For example, making computers, you have to set standards. Making cars, you have to set standards. Making chemicals, there's regulation like explosives, and mining, construction, like making houses, like you have to have minimum standards of construction. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Is there a minimum standard for making clothes? No, there isn't. So there's no minimum standard to say you need to not have hazardous chemicals in your clothes. You must pay someone a minimum wage or a living wage, whatever it is, right? There has to be standards, like to make something. And it is something that is, to me, top of mind in terms of how we tackle fashion in the future. It is actually something that is quite easy to tackle. You can do that now. Governments can actually do that. And that's why fashion's been lagging. The other thing that fashion hasn't done is research and development. So all of their what you call wealth that's been generated in the last couple of decades, especially from the fast fashion businesses, hasn't really gone into R&D. I talk about it a lot in terms of the fashion supply chain and why we've gotten to where we are. Why are we so slow at the uptake? I mean, come on, you gotta have proper treatment systems for pollution, for stacks, for dust collection in all sorts of different factories out in Asia or in Africa or in sort of any of the global South company sort of geography, nations. This is all like a given. The technology is already there. It's not like we don't have environment protection authorities in these countries. These things are already there. It's just a matter of, having it being a normal situation in these sorts of industries, but it's not normal for fashion. It's normal for construction. It's normal for mining. It's normal for agriculture. Fashion, no. And so the R&D equation is important. If you look at how much profit or net sales that come into tech companies or construction companies or automotive companies or even chemical companies, the amount of money they make, they actually like go into a stream where they improve their industry, right? Fashion hasn't done that. Fashion on average has only contributed 0.1% of all of their net sales into R&D. And this is why we still don't have technology to recycle our clothes at the end of its life.
Yeah.
And I can talk about this forever, and it's something that
Mm,
really boils my blood. I mean,
yeah.
that number's probably gone up a little bit now, but it is still minuscule.
Yeah.
And
No.
so this is
Yeah.
why fashion is so slow in its uptake of
Mm,
just being clean, being transparent, just literally being on top of things, to be honest. Why are we even having this
mm,
conversation right now?
yeah. Honestly.
Um, in terms of the future of fashion, I always say to people, we always need to consume based on what our values are. So, and also have businesses based on those values. If you want to create a business, it needs to be based on those values. Like what kind of a better place are you trying to create for the world and the inhabitants in it? Are you trying to enrich people's lives? Are you trying to increase biodiversity? Are you trying to regenerate soil? It has to come from that instead of coming from a different place. So you
Mm,
are correct to say that maybe fashion is very much on the outset a very shallow or profit seeking business, because it is based at the moment on aesthetics instead of function. But the way fashion needs to be now is we need to marry the two. You can still have
mm,
function and aesthetics,
mm,
and you can still make things that are valuable to people. And I always tell people to support local heritage, and sort of celebrate them. Going back to my grandma's stories, if I tell anyone to buy anything new, I'm just saying, like, if you need to buy anything new, I'm not going to stop you. But if you do, make sure that it passes the grandma test. And what I mean by this is that I see clothes in my grandma's wardrobe that is from the 1920s or the 1930s, and I touch it, and I can feel what she felt when she touched it. It's very sentimental.
mm,
And even now I think about it, I'm quite teary because you know those things have gone through
mm,
such a different world than us. They've made it with love. You see the lace in her clothes, and you want to feel that in anything that you consume now, anything that you
mm.
buy. um, there's a lot of thought that's gone into it, and exactly as you said, yeah, compassion.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your knowledge and your heart. If I may, like what you talked about earlier, like the fact that fashion has just lagged behind so much in terms of being almost legitimized as awkwardly as both an industry and as a art form. Almost, it's a form of art. I couldn't help but think, like the way I sort of processed what you were saying, like comparing fashion with like the automobiles industry, with agriculture, with construction, with these very men-led, they are very sort of like um work that's not women's work. Fashion has historically been so linked and so attached to the identity of women, of homemakers who are women. So this is just me. I might be just, opening a completely different can of worms here, but just wanted to know what you think about this.
If you want to single out sort of women's work, I mean, obviously, yes, we have to acknowledge that a lot of fashion is still not mechanized. You still have to use a lot of hands and threading and needle and beading and stuff like that. But it's actually not necessarily that is not necessarily the reason why fashion is not regulated. No, not at all.
Mm,
If you want to look back at history, a lot of artisans in Italy making beadwork and stuff, they're all men.
you're right. Fair.
Uh,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
leather artisans are men. Beadwork artisans are also men in certain countries. So you have to explore some of these questions. Maybe when we think about that, we think of maybe our region, Asia. And
Mm,
Asia is very much sort of women heavy in terms of a lot of the housework and things like that. But that's
mm,
a
mm, mm,
cultural
mm,
thing. It just so happened it's and I don't want to go into that, that's another conversation, but you know, but that's why maybe that's what we imagine, because we're both Asian. But if you look at different sort of countries, in terms of Brazil or in terms of Italy, yes, women do some of these work, but it's a different cultural
fair.
yeah.
I think what made me think of bringing this up is also because, like, you know, every time when we speak about clothing and, like, you know, stories of wear, we're always mentioning about it's always women's voices that we're amplifying and that we're referencing and that we're sort of like being inspired by, like, you know, speaking about our grandmother's clothing and, you know, her practices of wear. It's so female centric, it's women centric.
And you have to maybe go back to the history a little bit, and you know, that's another conversation. And it's very fascinating how we have now contributed that industry to women. But I agree that it is a very easy relationship to make. I think we had to celebrate women's efforts, you know, in that time. So, you know, Dior came up with, you know, it was a pioneer at that stage, big sort of skirts, which we called it the new look after the war in the 1950s. And everyone wanted to look a certain way, and everyone wanted to celebrate, you know, looking very much more formal, because we've all toiling away, you know, with dust and mud and like making back-breaking stuff, because, you know, that's the history of it. And so, you know, when Dior came out with a new look, that really paved the way for women to kind of really be remembered for something other than just people in the background in the war efforts. So obviously that's a very westernized narrative of that history. There are more narratives that we need to have in this conversation to have a full balanced view. But, you know, that is something that I'd like to kind of bring up to just remind people of where that's come from. And I think women, you know, want to look good. And I think they do that through their clothes. And I think being able to own something that looks great. And obviously back in the day, things were made and very slowly, and, you know, fit it to your body and things like that. We're miles different than that now. But I think it was a way for us to celebrate, you know, our power. You know, clothes are very powerful. And I think that was a way to do that. You know, men celebrate their power a different way. You know, they might be able to afford a packet of cigarettes, or I don't know, afford a car, and that's a very manly thing to do. Obviously, there are stereotypes in gender norms in this sort of conversation, but that is the history we're talking about, how it all happened. And it is very easy to relate fashion with women, and that's probably why. And when I talk about moderns, this is modern history anyway, in the last 100 years, you know. So it's important to understand the context. And I think moving forward, you are absolutely correct. We have to take back that power, to be honest, because a lot of the designers and a lot of the what we call cutting people, the people who don't do necessarily such backbreaking or dirty work, are men. So men actually own factories in the global south most of the time. And the reason why they do is that it's because they're just better salesmen, you know, like in that situation anyway. And so they take advantage of people who are less skilled than them, and it just so happens to be women. But I think nowadays, with the advent of technology and AI and automation, and, you know, 3D printing is now making homes in less than 3 hours. You know, I don't know if you know, we can make homes on the spot now. We don't have to concrete them, pile them into a hole, make them into a mold, and truck them to site. We can make homes 3D now in 3 days. And so fashion can absolutely change. And women are the ones who are actually understanding what our needs are functionally and also aesthetically. So I think there's absolute possibility, you know, for women to, you know, reverse, you know, what what you might call a traditional role for them in
Yeah,
fashion.
for sure, for sure. I think also like this conversation just needs to, like, we need to hold space for a lot of new ones when we speak about, like, when we have this conversation, right? Because it's just so, like, I mean, fashion is really at the intersection of a lot of other issues that have to be talked about. And also, like you were mentioning that, you know, clothing is powerful, and clothing can be, it can take after different forms. It can be celebration, forms of celebration. It can be also used for like self-reclamation, and especially right now that it's a party. And also just like being able to feel empowered and liberated by our clothing. I think that's also incredibly powerful. And today I'll hold space and be thankful for that, you know, that clothes can do that for us. And
So
for
you can
sure,
still feel great in the clothes that you wear, as long
for
as you
sure.
are compassionate and you're conscientious about where those clothes are coming from. If anything, businesses in this day and age, for example, I mean, if you look at H&M's and Zara's sort of shareholders report in terms of their revenue streams, they've actually been profiteering less and less every quarter because, you know, of other things that have happened. Obviously, consumers are a little bit more woke. I hate to use that word, but a little bit more sort of aware of some of the shady things that are happening. And they're also maybe looking back at their own individual style and and pausing. You know, I think COVID, the pandemic, has actually made things a little bit better that way, to ask us from within what it is actually that we want and what it is that we're aligning ourselves with, what is important to us. And even though like maybe the first maybe few months last year, when it was at the height of the pandemic, people were probably buying a lot online and things like that. I think some of those things have died down now because, you know, people are like, well, it was just to make them feel better for a little bit, you know? And so in the future, I see companies who don't engage, who don't change their business practices, who don't sort of operate responsibly with compassion, with, you know, ethics in mind, they're gonna drop off. They're not gonna survive. So nowadays, I mean, the world is, even though it's a competitive place, it's also it's a very hard space to operate in. Any businesses that want to leave a legacy for future generations have to start with the right purpose and the right why. And that is how you actually evolve through the ages.
That's right. I agree. Yeah. And I think companies, fashion companies, brands, and, you know, they really need to reflect the current state of the world. And if they don't, like you said, they will be eliminated.
Absolutely. They'll get left behind. So
they'll
I
get
think
left behind.
the world will correct itself. I am very, very sure of that.
Self-cleansing. It will
really
cleanse and detox.
They've been on this ride for a couple of decades now, and I think anyone that wants to start a new business now, you know, even if they make a short-term profit, even Shein, you know, I don't know what they're going to pitch into, what kind of products they're going to sell after this. They might reemerge as another name selling something else. But at the end of the day, they're a data company, as I said before. You know, I think it's all short-term sort of gains. And if you want to have a business that has a legacy, a long-lasting legacy, then, you know, think about the product you're selling and how you're going to sustain that.
Before we wrap up, because we didn't like cover what you were wearing, like what you're wearing right now. Can you just like as a wrap up, like just tell us what you're wearing and where you are at the moment?
I am actually currently wearing a pink knit sort of jumper. It's made out of cotton. It looks like one of those, like, you know, like one of those Tommy Hilfiger / Ralph Lauren sort of preppy sort of jumpers.
The preppy look. Yeah.
It's a hand-me-down from my sister, and I've had this for the last couple of years. Well, the last year and a half anyway, since I came to Melbourne. And I'm wearing a secondhand pair of Hudson jeans, which I got at Savers, which is a shop here that sells secondhand clothes. And yeah, so all secondhand clothes here. I haven't shopped new for a long time. I think
Yeah.
people have to really look inside themselves. If they haven't already, you read my latest blog post. It's called Is There a Perfect Wardrobe? And we talk
Mm-hmm.
about, you know, consuming differently, coming from the right place,
Yeah.
and coming from having a look at your traumas and having a look at your identity and having a look at why you do such things. And if you can incorporate certain sort of values into your life at the moment in terms of your
Wow.
consumerism, then that's a good
Yeah.
place to start.
It's really valuable. I will be linking all of the blog posts that you've mentioned throughout the episode in the show notes. So everyone, please go read them. I know
Cool.
I will be reading
Thank
them after this. So that was such an incredibly informative and insightful conversation with Najah, and I really am so appreciative of her time. And I'm just gonna wrap up this episode by saying that, you know, I had so many questions coming into this recording, and some of them's been answered, some of them are not. And in fact, I have more questions, and I think that's because we cannot speak about everything in 1.5 hours, and that's just impossible because this conversation is incredibly nuanced, and we need to recognize that and hold space for that. Real-time fashion companies, specifically companies like Shein, they are after profit, investment capital, and market share. They do not care for ethics. They do not care for consumer well-being, uh, or even having a healthy and responsible brand image. I'll go as far as to say that as long as people on TikTok continue to buy from them, and as long as they can continue to afford exorbitant celebrity endorsements. In the same Green is the New Black article that I mentioned earlier, um, writer Tammy Gunn mentions that whether or not this desire to buy more is natural, it certainly is manufactured and enhanced by our modern culture, institutions, and systems. Again, Shein isn't a fashion company. It is a tech and big data company commodifying clothing for profit. Under fast and real-time fashion supply chain, clothing just becomes products for sale.